Well, thank you very much for coming. It's nice to see all your bright and shiny faces. We're really happy to have you here at Lester's exhibition, and want to use this as an opportunity to share stories about Lester, as well as talk about his career and who he was as a man, as a father, and especially as an artist. I expect to hear some good and funny and truthful stories about him. I know we all have one. I want to introduce, I'm Sherry Hartbauer. I'm the executive director of the Leedy Foundation. The foundation used this exhibit as our inaugural show to announce that we are going to begin showing more artists who've had an impact on our community as an introduction into what we hope will become a new museum just for the collection and the exhibition and the preservation of our artists in Kansas City who have had a huge impact here, a lot of them from the Art Institute, so we can preserve that for future generations. It's a big, big goal, but this is the start of it, so thank you for being here. I want to introduce our panelists. You may know them, but this is Jake Goldman. This is Lester's son. This is Catherine Goldman. She was married to Lester for how many years?
37, I think.
Talking to the mic.
37?
Thank you.
Sorry.
It's on record now.
This is Warren Rosser, a good friend, a former boss, the one who hired Lester to come to the Art Institute. And this is Jim Woodfill. Jim is your position at the Art Institute have something to do with Lester's position there?
Well, I'm the chair of the painting department. I'm the chair of the painting department right now.
Okay.
And I've got the position that Warren had for 30-some years.
Wow. Okay. I want to remind our panelists that because we're recording this today for posterity and for legacy, to please speak into the microphone so that when we watch the video, we can hear everything you have to say. I want to start with Catherine.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you to tell my favorite story about Lester in terms of the artist you married and the artist you ended up with.
Oh, that story.
Yes.
Well, I guess in a nutshell, I hope, when Lester and I first met and married, he was painting in a realistic style, and I really liked that a lot. I thought he was great at it, and he used models and painted from life. And I don't know how many years later, but he was always in his studio mucking about. And one day he came in for dinner, of course, all covered with paint. And he kind of stopped at when he got into the kitchen, stopped inside the door, and sort of announced that he'd finally gone abstract. And I was like, no, no, I married a realist. I don't want to be married to an abstract painter. I really fought that for quite some time. I mean, it was so foreign to me, and I really didn't like those early abstractions very much. Over the years, I've learned to love them. But it was such a dramatic shift, and just for him to say that, it was kind of shocking. Anyway, is that the story as
Yes,
you remember
that's the
it?
story.
Okay.
And I'm not going to ask you guys to wait for me to tell you what I'd like to hear, but this does segue right into Warren's story about when this happened.
Yeah, Lester, we would travel to Chicago on occasions in his minibus. And this one time we drove into a snowstorm, a real blizzard, that every other car was off the road. He kept chugging along. It was a great opportunity to talk about, our work, his thoughts, and he had began to sort of start working on, he had done genre paintings for so long that I think he was getting a little frustrated, a little sort of, in a way, it was getting too predictable for him. And he started to talk about a phrase that has really stuck with me for a long time, and that is the idea of de-skilling oneself. Taking the refinement of the genre paintings and like breaking it down. He would shift from a pencil to a felt tip pen. If you've ever tried shifting, the marks you make, the images you create are very different. And you could smell luster coming like about a passageway away, because he had his shirt on with 6 pens, and he would draw with them. And it was like he was purposely de-skilling himself from the genre paintings. And I always thought that was fascinating, how one could build a legacy of Catherine's representative paintings, and then decide, you wanted to shift directions.
And how long did it take before he was making decent paintings once he made the shift?
Took a while. He made some very ugly paintings, some very ugly paintings. We used to do studio visits, and he would stretch up a large canvas. I mean, some of these things were pretty damn big, but they were still hideous. But he felt he had to go through that process to find an avenue that he could sort of travel along.
How common is it for painters to shift the style of their paintings over their career in such a drastic way?
I think it's fairly rare. I do it consistently. I think a lot of artists, once they've established a style or a vehicle, tend to sort of protect it, stay with it. And I can't think of anything more boring than knowing what you're going to do when you walk in the studio. I think Lester, as I do, would scratch his head when he'd walk into the studio. What am I going to do now? He didn't know until he really touched the paper or the canvas or the clay. So I think it's quite rare, and certainly a drastic, a drastic shift like that. Richard has done it. He has changed his work, but it's pretty rare.
Jim, can you talk about that where it comes to art students? I mean, they are exploring in school to find themselves, right, to find their niche or their style of working.
It's, they think they do. And rarely, do you see an ex-student 10 years later doing the work that you recognize from school. But I think part of the legacy of this department, and certainly from Warren and Lester both, is that spirit of really kind of rejuvenating your thinking about what you're doing over and over, and continually adjusting that. I think I learned that in the school. I didn't study with Lester, and I studied a lot with Warren. But the nature of that department, the kind of the legacy of that department that I work to kind of maintain now is that investigating outside of the comfort zone, and that's just kind of fundamental.
I imagine that Lester must have taught that to his students. He wasn't the kind of artist who taught the students to paint exactly like he did. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure how it started, and that shift from that kind of atelier, here we're all going to paint now, that into kind of an individual studio practice for each student was a long evolution that Lester and Warren both kind of participated in, that we inherited, and but a way of being is more is maybe more accurate. The stories that I've heard and my understanding of Lester's, he's one of the few teachers that are actually working in the classrooms, in the studios with the students. He did. I don't know if anybody else has talked about it, but he had and I didn't experience it, but I've read about it, and there's a write-up in a book called The Art of the Assignment, Drawing with Your Eyes Closed, or something like that talks about different kinds of art and drawing assignments. And Lester had a project that was also part of his work, that was also a name of a show that he did in Joe Neese called Welcome to the Rag Ball. And that was really so he'd get this big, huge ball full of clothes from the thrift stores, all bundled up. I was thinking about this morning. This is really an apt kind of analogy to his trajectory as a painter. It's all nice and neat and very ordered and formed very carefully, and then you go in and you cut the wire, and it goes boing and springs all over the place. And if you look at these paintings, that's kind of like what happened. But then to work through that with the students that would make things out of the rags and the clothes, that would draw from it. Models would come in and put the clothes on and wear, students would salvage through and find clothes that they liked and take with them, and then it just kind of went from there. It was an amazing kind of an experience for the students.
It's very clever for an artist to bring his studio work into the classroom, and thereby getting a little more time to produce his work, because he's now doing it among his classes. Can someone talk about the first time he brought performance into an opening?
Well, here.
Okay.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
And I'm not clear on the dates, but he had sort of a 10-year period where he had the idea to do 3 separate extravagant kind of happenings. That's the only way I can describe them. But each time he included students doing not just artwork, but used them. Well, for instance, that wheel on the wall that's called the Wheel of Misfortune, that was at the time when it was here on a big aluminum structure. And he had hired, or I don't know if he hired the student, but he asked a student to come and stand there and spin the wheel, and then wherever it landed, they got a little drawing that he had reproduced. He had about 5 different ones, and if it landed on a certain point, they'd get that as like a little prize. So it was kind of like a carnivalesque type occasion. But even in that, and I don't remember if this was in that, but he had hired 2 pair of modern dancers that we knew. They were twins, Sandy and Cindy, and he had each one buy a leotard and bring it to the studio, and one had a white leotard and one had a black leotard, and he had them put those on in the studio, and then he drew black things on the white one and white lines on the black one. Anyway, they danced in an enclosed area in this gallery where he had a TV playing with war footage, I think, wartime footage, and it was called the War Room. So there was that happening while the wheel was spinning, and then Jake was walking on stilts, drumming his drums. He was 15, and he was always good with balance and things like that, skiing and skateboarding and walking on stilts. But so yeah, that was one that I really remember, how he incorporated the students and had them help with these little sort of stations along the way in this carnival of the absurd kind of. But one other thing that reminded me about how Lester would involve the students, or maybe help the students get out of their comfort zone, like in the drawing studio, I remember, and I learned this years later, a young man came up to me, and this was after Lester had passed, and he said, Lester kind of like saved my life as an artist, because I was just stuck in this certain way of drawing. And Lester approached him in the studio and said, well, here's what you have to do. And he took this drawing and he tore it in half this way, and he tore it in half the other way, and rearranged the squares. And he said, okay, now look at this and see. Like, it was permission given to just not be so precious about what you're trying to do. Just tear it up and turn it upside down and be inspired. So I don't know exactly, but this particular young man was so grateful that Lester had done that for him. It was permission to think outside the box, I guess. So another little
Do there happen to be any
anecdote.
former students of Lester's here? Do you
Brett?
want to share anything about Lester as a teacher?
Well, he broke my head.
Oh.
In a good way. No, in a good way. I came to the Art Institute. I had already had a BFA, a way of doing things. And I studied with Lester, I think 2 years, my 2 years, junior and senior, in Warren. And Lester, the thing I remember most is when I got there, everybody was trying to paint like Lester. Well, not everybody, but there were a lot. And I didn't like it. And then I was like, then I met the man, and it's like, okay, I get why. And he did that, you know, he ripped the paper up. He did that to my head. You can think differently. I've never stayed on a path since I met Lester. I mean, I'm always throwing a wrench in the work and seeing what can come out, like they said. I mean, I'm not an artist that has stayed the course in a certain style. The biggest thing I remember about Lester is my senior year in a studio visit. He came in, and we were always talking about books, but he came in and he started talking about the dust on the floor. And I'm there going, what? And then he left, and I looked around, and it made sense. I can't tell you how it made sense, but it made sense. The dust, my paintings, everything, it made sense. And, you know, I visited Lester every time I came back to Kansas City after that. I mean, that was it. Books and dust. Brett Chenoweth.
And do you live here in Kansas City?
I do now, yes.
Thank you for sharing. Jake, talk to us about your dad's studio life and how it affected you.
Yeah, I got to see some of this in kind of the back scenes behind the curtain. And some of the themes that have been mentioned so far remind me that he was efficient and just, always he had relations with guys at the scrapyard, the thrift stores. He drove me to early in the morning on a Saturday up to the 63rd Street Drive-In just to look at tools, and he would just he really didn't think twice about just constantly doing something. He had this saying, "Awalia," so while you're out doing this, do that. They'd never go to the store just for milk. You'd have to work it into a hardware store visit and a grocery store visit. And he was efficient with his art that way, I feel like, because when you look at the body of the work, he was so prolific. He was just working nonstop. And you could tell his brain was never at rest. He was always changing, always morphing. And I think maybe he was morphing his work every 5 years, but we might see the result of that in every 10 years or something like that. But I have this one little story about the Guignol Mobile. Some of you know about it. It's this sculpture that had moving parts, puppets and spinning things, and it was on wheels. It was a big aluminum frame with wood, and it had wheels that were only about this big with thin rubber on them. And he had to get it from our house to downtown. So he just hooks it up to the back of the truck, kind of at a low angle. The back two wheels are touching, and we drive all the way down Main Street from 57th to 10th, going about 10 miles an hour, holding up traffic, and the thing's just like shaking, wobbling, it's barely hanging together. And ever since then, that sculpture has kind of circulated around downtown. It's always a myth now, where's the Guignol Mobile? We actually talked about maybe getting it into this show. We didn't happen, but it's somewhere downtown.
We were actually invited to bring it into the show.
That's right.
But because of its weight and scale,
Hook it up to a
didn't
pickup
quite
truck.
have the energy to bring it in, and then knew that once we did, it might stay here forever.
Yeah.
And so we may have to do a show around that.
Yeah, but that's just kind of the energy that I saw. He was always moving, always changing. He painted on the back of canvases. He'd repaint things, paint on top of paintings. And that was part of the transition from the early realists. You can see some of the ones where he painted on top of in that thought process of transitioning. But I just was fortunate to grow up around all that activity that was always going on around the house. Got to go out to the studio and help him stretch canvases and meet the students. He'd have a party at the house with the senior students. They'd invite him over. You could tell he had a real connection with his students. And I've heard many stories like yours over the years of his impact on his students, his connection with the students. But an interesting thing is he wouldn't officially become friends with a student until you graduated, because that's how the Rossers, the Trillings, and my parents were three tight-knit friends, but he wouldn't agree to be friends with the Trillings, Howard's here, until Jerry graduated. So he had boundaries, but other than that, they were pretty loose, and he definitely developed a strong connection with the students, I could tell.
I think with, going back to his work, I think drawing has always been the sort of center of his work. If you look at the early genre paintings, there's a touch that's so delicate, and he feels every mark he's making. And even though he changed from a pencil to a felt tip pen, there's still a sense of touch, a sense of drawing. Or his new tool, the router. I mean, he burned up I don't know how many routers. Because he could draw with it. He loved the idea of drawing with, like, this object. And I don't know if you've ever used a router. you can't really control fine lines, you just move around. It takes you, and you have to try and hang on to it and move it. But I think his sense of drawing is always embedded in his work. And I think the drawing thing just gave him permission to move in different directions. He always had drawing as a sort of a base camp he could move out of. I forgot what I was going to say now.
What's interesting too about the router is you're taking material away, whereas most painting you're adding material, right? So, and he was, the routing stuff is in the eaves. It's back there on the spinning wheel and that little piece in the corner, but it's all throughout the studio. He really did a lot with the router, all over. Yeah.
Can you please explain, because for anyone who's not been to the Goldman house, to say that the routed drawings are in the eaves is a literal message.
Yeah, you look up and
The soffits.
the eaves under the roof, plywood routed out.
It was a literal while because our eaves were rotten. They needed to be replaced. So he got all these long boards to replace the rotten boards, but before he put them up, he routed designs into these boards, and then he made two, I don't know what you call it, prints that he hand rubbed, like he put color and stuff and made prints like 9.5 feet long by 2 feet wide prints. And then he was done, he had them put up under, the soffits and sprayed. So he'd sprayed them black so that where it was routed would show up and then rolled white. So, and we'd have workmen, like after one of the big ice storms and our mast came down, the electricity thing, fell off the house, and the guys came to replace it, put it back up, and they were like, whoa, what's this? They were so amazed. And, sometimes we have people over to visit the studio and always remind them to look up, and they're so blown away by all this art under the eaves.
See how efficient that is? That's 3 things. Fix the house, get a poster,
and make prints.
And dabble with woodblock printing.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I don't know, I was going to say something else, but go ahead.
Does anyone else here have a story they'd like to share about Lester? Yeah.
I said, we were friends. My wife was a student of Lester, and she would say, she had started her career at the Art Institute in Chicago, and then she went to Art Institute, and she said she never had a teacher like Lester. She said he was blown away with. She was so excited from his classes. So, that's the kind of influence he had on her. But my favorite story is one time I had made the mistake of being over at their house, and it was like right before one of the vacations we're going to start that week, either spring or Christmas or whatever. And I said, "Oh, you're going to be off. You're going to have. What are you going to do on your vacation?" And he looked at me like, "Vacation? That's the time we start to work." That's what he felt. I mean, school was great. It was a distraction. What he really wanted to be is a studio.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Anyone else? I want to ask if you'll talk a little bit about Lester's transition at the end of his life and tell us the story of how he got to the point where he wasn't making paintings anymore and that it turned into the gourd sculptures that we see here. Would someone please tell us about that, because that was clearly a big transition.
Well, I think he couldn't lift stuff. He needed something that was lightweight and could be, shaped and by putting things together. It also reflects the sort of his concern about the medical profession, his existence, and like the balancing act between the gods. I think in a way, the gods, in a sense, represented him. I think they were a metaphor for his being. And he would situate them in a piece of apparatus, whether he'd find it or he'd put it together. I think it was sort of a cathartic experience for him, because he could deal with what was happening to him in a sort of, he could manifest it in front of him. I helped him on putting some pieces together, and was fortunate enough to, along with Catherine and a couple of other people, put an exhibition of these together, which he was able to attend. I think that was what really made it very special. And I think the gourd pieces, and I think he found them in Oklahoma or Arkansas. He'd take a road
I think
trip.
it was southern Missouri
Southern
somewhere.
Missouri.
But we, once a year, we took or maybe even twice a year, there was a gourd farm down there. And we would just take our car, some old big sedan that we had, and we'd fill the trunk and the back seat, just totally full to the ceiling with gourds. He would pick them all out, and they were kind of ratty, had laid around in the field for a year or so, and then we'd get them home, and it was usually then pretty close to when school was out in May, and he'd sit on the patio and clean them with like vinegar and whatever to stop the mold, and scrub them down and let them dry, and then he'd sort of cut them apart and start playing around with fitting them together in some kind of new shape. And I think the gourds really kind of happened before he ever knew he had cancer.
Right.
He blamed his back pain on, years of lifting big, heavy aluminum pieces, metal pieces, big wood, for his sculptures. They were always really heavy. And he just thought, I need to find a lighter material for my sculpture. And that's what started the gourds. Now, the gourds that ended up in that show and these ones that he painted green probably were more, like you said, towards the time of his
I think, though, that
sort of,
he may not have known,
right,
but I think intuitively
yeah,
he knew something was happening.
right. But he was searching for a
And
lighter
he was
material.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
that certainly gave him the opportunity to make large things, out of something very light.
Right.
And then because gourds are so beautifully curvaceous and amorphic kind of, he liked those, it gave him the opportunity to make those sort of beautiful curvy shapes out of, just putting gourds together. And then he sprayed them Volkswagen green. I think it was called Cyber Green at the time. When was it, 1990? Volkswagen Beetle came out with that shade of green, and he bought cans and cans of that and sprayed lots of things that color. But for they're not here, but he had a floor piece with 4 round balls that he took to the auto body place downtown.
Childs.
Wild Child, right. And they hung them in their big bay and sprayed them with that auto body paint, and they were so shiny and gorgeous, but the gourds, you couldn't really do that. But then we called it Goldman Green. And then for a while, we all bought things that were sort of, my daughter and, everybody, we were all buying green things.
I
But
think it's the last time I saw Lester, he was working on the boards, and it, when you were talking about them being a metaphor for him, I think maybe more in analogies than metaphors, but they really seem to be. And when I think of Lester's work and looking through kind of the evolution of it, I think a lot about the idea of the human machine, of the body as a processor, so you think about observing the world and making things after you observe the world as some sort of translation. I always thought of Lester's work as a direct response. Mm-hmm. Like the world's coming at him and he's responding, and it's just this fast kind of pace thing. And he was working on the boards, and I got to help set up that show. I remember it was in the Crossroads Gallery on Main, and one of them broke, and so we took it back to the house, and Lester was sitting out on the patio, just like frantically trying to put this really delicate joint of this gourd back together, and it was just a really poignant moment, and he was like, it's gotta kind of just hold on just a little longer.
I want to come back to something that you said, Warren, and ask you to talk a little bit more about the idea of when an artist goes into the studio, they don't necessarily say, I'm going to create work about this now, about having back pain, or I'm not going to create work that is about this, and then it's going to create it like that, but that is more of a studio narrative that happens between maybe your unconscious and what comes through your hands to create it. I think that concept makes sense to artists, but for anyone who's not an artist, it's a little bit novel. Can you talk about that a little bit, either you or Jim?
It's mysterious.
Yeah.
No, I think it's not that you're blindly working. I think you have a general sense of where you are. You've created previous work. I think that work you've done leads to what you're going to do. It's like taking what you know and moving into what you don't know. He was very much about opening up these avenues of things that he didn't have a clue about. I think that's why he explored, theater, music, science, performance, and also text. The one thing that isn't here, surprisingly, are his paper bag pieces. He would take grocery sacks, and at first he'd do drawings on the side that had no text. It was the inside of the paper bag. But then I think he began to realize that the text meant something. And he'd collage it, he'd move it around. I think that's what maybe led to the pattern pieces.
Yeah. Like this piece over here with pieces of sewing patterns
Right.
attached to the paper.
It's like taking something that has a history and putting it into a new context. I think even in his genre paintings, you start something, you never know where it's going to end. You know, in a sense, a work is never ending. You stop because you can't do any more to it, or you're tired of it, or I'm going to leave it alone. There's many reasons why a work exists the way it does, because you simply stop working on it. I do the same thing. You know, I try to work through and, you know, discover something, but maybe you don't know that until you've left the studio and you go back to it. It's life enters the space, the working space, because you live in the larger world. And you go into this making space and you try to produce something that echoes your experience.
I want to add to that just a little bit, that students have a hard time with that also, when you're saying it's easy for an artist to kind of understand that. And I go back to the description that, do you remember Sean Downey, this student who wrote about the ragball class? He said, I don't remember the products that came out of that class. I don't remember anything that was finished. I just remember the process. And that ethic of process over product is a real fundamental part of how we think about painting as a process, as our department. So it really is a challenge to get students out of that mindset of here's this idea I have that I'm going to execute, and to use the process to allow it to inform you about what's going to happen. And this is all of this stuff.
I think there's a lot to be said for artists playing with discovery over product, and Lester was a big proponent of that. It was almost like intuitive science. You broke it to see what would happen, and the product didn't matter. It was the discovery that mattered.
It's like the journey.
Yeah.
The journey is more important
Yeah.
than the final piece. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think that's right. It's a lot of ways to say it,
Yeah.
but it's that responsiveness. It's making a mark and looking at it and trying to recognize what it is you've done, and now what do you have to do to fix that, and how do you fix that? And it seems to be this continual fight against entropy or something, or this sense of repair. But that's something pretty fundamental to Lester's work.
The last talk we had in the gallery was by Richard Mattson recently, and he talked about having numerous paintings in process all the time.
Yeah.
Did Lester work that way too?
Yeah, I think muscle memory also and technique, staying practiced like a musician would, was part of his thought there. You know, he just always wanted to be working, so his technique was, natural. And not being a painter myself, but just being able to make a curve and be confident in it, you want to be, sure of your hand. And so he was constantly working, I feel like, partially for that reason.
There's a funny story of Lester and I would go to New York every so often to interview candidates for a position at the school. And usually I would sit opposite him, facing the door, and invariably Lester would be drawing. He'd just keep drawing. And this one time, this person came in, this young woman, who was so stunning that I was speechless. Lester spin around, put his drawing stuff down, and started talking with her. And he was determined to have her come to work with us. But unfortunately, she got a job at Rutgers. So we lost out.
Oh, darn.
This reminds me of, I had the privilege of looking through a lot of Lester sketchbooks in preparation for the show. And within were a lot of drawings, of course. And the books started from the back or the front. And there would be notes like from faculty meetings, clearly all educational, academic dates and things. And it would be surrounded by drawing, not doodling, but drawing.
Yeah.
And sometimes family notes.
A grocery list or something in there fixed into the book, yeah.
I think everybody is interested in seeing an artist's notebook, like they're always interested in seeing in the studio. That might be a fun show to put together at some point.
We've got a ton.
I want to bring us around to another story I heard that had something to do. I don't know if the piece is in the show, but there was a piece whose title had something to do with gallons of
Blue laughter.
blue laughter.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
55 gallons of blue laughter was the title of one of the shows that happened here. And Stanley Lewis, a former instructor at the Art Institute, and Lester were kind of buddies that occasionally we joked around and said would put on the dog and pony show, kind of the way they taught or lectured together. It was kind of humorous. And anyway, they were always trying to save money because they both used paint like frosting on a cake, kind of, and paint was really expensive, and the wives would always be upset, that our grocery budget is going to paint. So they were going to try to save money by making their own paint. So they ordered a 55-gallon drum of linseed oil. And they got a whole bunch of empty paint cans, and Lester had a used paint mixer in the basement. And they had dried pigments so they could make their own paint. Well, the delivery service that dropped off this giant 55-gallon drum wouldn't bring it up the driveway to the studio, and so they just dropped it off at the bottom of the driveway. And the two of them kind of tipped it and rolled it along up the driveway to our basement steps. And it's this tiny little area, but Lester got at the bottom of the basement steps, and Stan was at the top holding this drum. And they opened the spigot and they had the paint can there to receive the oil, and nothing came out. And then one of them, I don't remember which one, said, "Oh, look, there's this other little thing." And they opened that, and when it let the air in, the oil just came spilling out. And they just both fell back laughing. So that's the 55 gallons of blue laughter. Well, they figured it out and did use most of the oil for making paint, but that incident was the title then of that show, 55 Gallons of Blue Laughter. And there are little blue drums in some of these works, maybe those. He also got little wooden spools like from sewing thread that looked like a 55-gallon blue, and he painted them blue and kind of hid them here and there in some of the sculptures, or painted little blue drums into some of the paintings and drawings. You'll see one every now and then, and now you'll know what started that.
All I can
Anyway.
think is glug, glug.
Glug, glug, glug. Yeah, but, yeah, a lot of funny stories like that. And you mentioned about vacation. Yeah, you want me to go on a vacation? I have the whole summer to paint. What are you talking about? And it took me several years to convince him that, yes, we needed to have a family vacation. 1 week. You've got to give me at least 1 week. I was working a full-time job, the kids, in school, and summers they were home. And so I insisted, and we went to Colorado once a year right before school started. He'd paint all summer, and the last week, which sort of coincided with his birthday, August 15th, we would go for a week right before school started to Colorado. Of course, he took many sketchbooks, but also books of subjects that he was interested in reading. And this was before cell phones. You remember this? He always would go on a solitary hike for his birthday. He just wanted to be alone in nature. And this was before our daughter Amanda was born. So Chris and Jake and I would drop him off at the trailhead, and we would arrange a time to come back and get him, usually like 5 o'clock, right before dinner. And when we came back this one time, he wasn't there. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and we got really worried. And did we call the park rangers or something? I mean, we were scared. But he showed up several hours later, and he had gotten lost. He had gotten lost and went the wrong way on the wrong trail. So that was interesting, but we did love going to Colorado.
Does anyone else have a
Once a
story
year.
they'd like to share about Lester?
E.G.
So he was my teacher. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm E.G. Schimpf. I'm a photographer. I worked with Lester, photographed his work for a long time, and he was my teacher, and I think we started at the Art Institute at the same time, maybe?
Yeah, probably.
67, 66 is when I
Yep.
started, 67. And I was in the painting department, and I had come out of foundations, and in foundations I was making constructions using found materials, etc., but I used woodworking tools. And when I got into the painting department, I don't know how many people are familiar with the Art Institute, but they have now what's called Central Shop. In the Central Shop, all the tools that you might need to build something are there, and you can go there and... But anyway, I had to do this in the painting department, and I brought saber saw, circular saws, wood, and I was doing my thing, really enjoying it, and I think Lester enjoyed what I was doing, but I'm not sure if Wilbur, some of the other teachers appreciated the noise and the dust, and so Lester had to slowly but surely get me into painting a little more than I wanted to do, and I appreciate him for doing that, and it worked out really well. But anyway, I was taking a lot of LSD, and I wanted to go to California, tune in, turn on, and drop out. But, so I did. I left school, and I went as far as Tulsa, my hometown, and I didn't get any further than that, and I was there for 2 years, and then I came back to the school, and at this point I was very committed to painting, and I wanted to paint representational paintings, and so this was perfect with Lester, and but at the same time I bought a camera, and I started photographing a lot, and I didn't show up to class a lot, and was out taking pictures, but the last 2 weeks I did about 8 paintings, and for my final review, and Lester goes, "E.G., I know you weren't here, and I know you just did these paintings, so what's up? And I said, oh man, I've been out taking photographs. And he goes, really? Well, show me your photographs. He said, I love photography, and I took photography. And anyway, I showed him my photographs, and he gave me a B in the class. So then I went into the photography department and lived happily ever after. But anyway, I ended up photographing Lester's work a lot. And one thing is, when I went over to work in his studio, I always had to be sure I had clothes on that didn't matter, because you weren't going to leave there without paint on you.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing is, I don't want to get into it, but his transition from representational painting to abstraction was a huge thing to me, because I was committed to representational painting, and I was trading with him and was excited about getting one of those nice, and we talked about genre painting, and we had and he studied with William Bailey, Leland Bell, and this is, this isn't like somebody that just, it just was, I remember coming to the house one time, and he was prostrate on the couch in the living room, and he had just I don't know what had happened, but it was just like, there was some event, you could tell, in his life where he really this is new and different, and just from that point, it was an explosion of what you see here, and it just was so incredible that the energy and the amount of work that came out of that. But I did always wonder about that transition. I think Stanley Lewis might have had something to do with it. That's kind of some of my thinking on it. I don't know that Stan. I don't know. That's I always wonder about what influence Stan had on that.
Well, I could speak to that a little bit, because when he was doing the really beautiful, realistic sort of in the style of the old Dutch masters, he really embraced that and dug into the whole technique of using a panel and all the glazing, and just like Vermeer and everybody did. But then once he mastered that, and then we would go to New York every year with his portfolio and go around to galleries. And they always said, well, we really like your work, but where's your studio? And we'd say Kansas City, and that was the end of that. So we always wished we could have moved Kansas City 50 miles outside of New York City, but of course that couldn't happen. So, I think he reached a point where he had mastered that technique, and he finally realized that if a gallery had picked him up at that time, he would have been locked into painting that way the rest of his life. And I think that's when it clicked. I don't want to be forced to do this forever. I've accomplished this, and now I'm going to move on. And I think he probably made this, I don't really remember, but it feels like he made the switch pretty quickly. Like, I'm free. I could just, Yeah, and it was just, and he'd come in with just, and if I didn't call him into dinner, he would never have eaten. So, I'd call from the back door to the studio, come on in, it's time to eat, and he'd come in all covered with paint, so there's always was paint on the floor and everywhere, and that time when I said I didn't want to be married to an abstract painter, oh well. And then once he came in, this is years later, but he came in, he'd make these pronouncements. He walked in to the kitchen door and said, I finally gave myself permission to use purple. It's like, what academic painter ever used purple, right? Hardly ever, right? And that kind of started all the, neon green and pink and purple and all those funny colors. Anyway.
Does anyone else want to share?
Kai, you had something to say at some point, no? I thought.
Yeah, I've known the Goldman's tell us, my name is Kai Anderson, and I went to the Art Institute, and I graduated in 1995, but my parents also went to the Art Institute, and I think my mom was one of his first students were around. Looking at Eugene, yeah. Yeah, so because of that, I knew him, my whole life, basically. He's got my whole life. And my first year of college, I went to college in California. And I don't know if this story is totally true, but this is what's been told to me by, I can't remember who. So, but he had found out that I went to college in California and was not okay with that. So he marched over to the admissions department and made them give me a better scholarship. So, I remember getting calls in my dorm in California many times from the Art Institute area being like, okay, we've got this scholarship for you, will you take that? And I was like, meh. I'm like 17 years old.
I think,
just like, I don't know.
I do think that's a true story. I kind of remember that.
And then one day they called and they were like, okay, we've got this scholarship. And I was like, deal, that's great. It was great, and I think I could pretty much thank Lester for giving me very tiny student loans, which I really appreciate for that. But he also, growing up in the city with all of these artists around me, he was always a huge inspiration to my work. And I only took one painting. In school, I always knew I was going to paint. So I figured, why take painting classes? I should take every other class to learn more things besides painting, because of course I thought I already knew how to paint, because I was 17, so. But the only class I did take in the painting department was with Lester, and it was a drawing class, and it was great.
Can you tell us your parents' names?
Kathy Marchant and Scott Anderson.
Okay.
Yeah, can you tell the face?
Can you turn so the camera can see the face? This might be a good time, since we just spoke to E.G., to talk about, segue a little bit into preserving Lester's legacy. E.G. was an enormous part of that, because in what year did you begin the inventory and the photographing of all of his work?
So he
20 years ago.
He died in 2005, and in 2006 or 7, Brad Nicholson afforded us the loan of a big warehouse. He just called me one day and said, how would you like to bring all of Lester's artwork out of the studio, out of the attic, out of the house, all bring it to one place so you could archive it and catalog it and photograph it. And so we did that thinking that we had about 3 months, because the space was for lease and we knew that people could come through and look at the space and maybe would rent it, and then we'd have to leave. Well, we were so fortunate, because 3 months turned into 7 months. And then we had a big show that was right at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, the big Life's Work show. And E.G. came every 2 or 3 days and photographed that whole time.
In regards
And
to
it was
having a
amazing.
retrospective show, that was like a retrospective show where everything was there.
Everything.
Usually, you're going to have somebody handpick and
Right.
curate this show, but
Everything
it
was
was like
there.
really amazing. To me, it's still like,
Yeah.
that was a
Yeah.
retrospective.
And
That was a retrospective
the
show.
fact that we actually were able to do that, I mean,
Yeah, thanks for that.
yeah, that was amazing.
So I want to talk a little bit about that, because the foundation here has been talking to a lot of artists and artist families who've been coming to us and saying, what are we going to do when the artist in our family dies and we have all of this work? We ourselves aren't artists. It's a lot. What do we do with it? And we are going to begin a series of lectures and workshops specifically for artists and their families to begin to give you the information for what you do need to be doing in order to protect your legacy as an artist. And I feel like as a parent, when we became parents, we all realized, well, I better get some of my affairs in order. If something happens to me, I need to have things in place for my child or my children. Your artwork is the same thing. It is your responsibility as an artist to protect that. Because if you don't, we all fear it will end up in a dumpster. And we will never be able to collect it again. It will be gone forever. And I can share that as we went through Lester's studio, and first of all, it's completely unusual for an artist to have a wife and a family and have the studio right there in the house, and so they're so connected to it. And so they understood so much about the work. And yet, because Lester was so prolific, I can't tell you how many paintings and drawings in here we debated about which end was up. I mean, something as simple as, if it's a completely non-objective piece, could you, at the very least, like, this end up on the back?
Oh, yeah. Or
Exactly.
right.
Whichever one you
And then as you, in fact, there was a large debate about one of the paintings in this show. And Catherine and Jake admitted they had each hung it in different directions over time in the house.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a funny story about it. But the other thing is that it's important for an artist to sign the works. I can only suggest, I'm a photographer and not a fine artist like this, but if you sign the work, we at least know which end is up. And the other thing we know is you feel this work is complete. It's at least complete, it's finished as of the day I signed it. And yes, artists go back and paint on their canvases again, but I know from my previous husband's work in printmaking that there were a lot of drawings or sketches or even prints that he made that were considered studies that he would never have shown in a gallery. And I'm going to suggest to artists, and this is I think just as important, you need to also kind of mark those as studies so that your family doesn't assume that absolutely everything you produce is a finished piece of art.
Oh, right.
Because it's not, right? We know it's not. And while it would be interesting, and it is interesting to see the process in which you create your work, to see your sketchbooks, it's also important to know this is something I never intended for the public to see. The other thing that is so critical, and this is what we'll talk about in future workshops, we will begin helping artists learn how to photograph their work. If you don't already know, I can tell you Richard Mattson is a master at photographing outdoors. When the light's right, he has beautiful photographs of his work. And to be honest, you know, a cell phone has become a very valuable tool, and at the very least, take a great picture with that. The other thing that's so important is if we had a laundry list of all the shows that he was in what year, what the name was, and maybe just kind of a description of that show. It used to be we always produced postcards, and that helps so much. And although even today we can go and look back at the postcards, and they will often say the exhibit is up from November 1 to November 30, but don't give the year.
Yeah. That was always.
And so if artists could think like, what would a historian think when they go through my work? How leave breadcrumbs to help them understand who you were, what you created, and how you did it. And that would be so valuable for the future, and so valuable in preserving your work appropriately. The Joan Mitchell Foundation has done an excellent, created an incredible workbook and videos about how to do exactly this. And we're going to use it as an outline of how to, share this with artists. I think maybe if we do it as a group, if we come together and say, all right, we're all going to learn how to take the photographs today, or I'm going to show you how to do an inventory and what that's like, that maybe if we come together, it might be easier for artists to begin to take it on. Yeah.
Hi. My name's Jack Thiel, and this is my wife, Joanna. And me neither, please. I'm very sorry that we're late. I was off on my meds this morning on purpose, but we went over with Patrick over to your the house in the back. Into your house, you had us over.
Yep.
And we were over at Point Down. And we have 4 pieces. We have Buck, in fact, my daughter, and we have 2 kids. One of them, Jack Jr., runs the Key Health Cancer Center. Janie's an anesthesiologist. They both like art. Me and Joe have been art lovers. We just bought a place down in Kirkwood. Redid it with, lights. And I've got a hallway. We have a hallway. We have to have you over sometime. There's 3 Lesters, 2 Lesters in that hallway. But Kansas City, I want my kids to want to know more, and their kids, and especially with somebody like Lester, who was in band for many, many years, and here this is for the right people alone. That has to be well known. He is to us. And sorry again if we're late, but I just really tickled to be here, and I don't know, Joe, if you have anything to add, but we told the kids, each of you, they're both a little over 40, around 40, we can give you guys one piece you can pick, but not this one and this one. And
That's cute. Yeah.
So now it's like, and they're going to bring the kids over. We have some friends coming over tonight. The first time they've seen us, we moved about 6 weeks ago. And it's just like an art gallery. It's like an art studio in our home. And we live it and love it. Lester is kind of an anchor for us.
Excellent.
So,
Good to know.
Thank you so much for coming. No, it's fine. We're glad to have you. When I visit friends' homes who've never purchased a piece of real art or who have known an artist whose work they can collect, I always feel like the walls feel very stale and almost like hotel rooms. And there's such a value in owning an incredible piece of work like Lester's. That's one of the other things that we want to address is it's important for collectors to have information about an artist that they can share with their family so that when you pass, your children will understand what is the value of this piece, who is the artist that created it, and understand something about them.
You know, right now, we're doing with our kids and our friends, like this afternoon, it's not a matter of, they love, oh, wow, who's this and who's that? And we put this together. I love putting, I always forget the term, salon style with all different shapes, and I love that. I would spend hours on it, but nonetheless, like they'll come over this afternoon, and Mary Jo will probably say, what is this? And they won't, because a lot of the abstract work. But it's like, well, let me tell you a little bit. I've got a file on each one of our pieces. Fantastic. I have documentation on different things, magazine articles, this, that, and whatnot, because I want as much, we're small folks. But we love art, and we want to try to be smart about it. And so I'll let you keep track.
It sounds like you're doing it exactly right.
Well, we're trying.
Thank you. Thank you. I think, unless there are, does anyone have any questions they want to ask of the panelists?
I want to ask you what the name of the foundation is.
It's called the Leedy. It's the Leedy Foundation, named after Jim Leedy. Let me tell you a little more about it. Before Jim died, he created the foundation in order to protect his own artwork and to protect the family from having the obligation of inheriting this incredibly valuable amount of work. Jim was just as bad as Lester, and there are artworks all over Jim's buildings and storage spaces that aren't signed, that we don't know a lot of details about. But Jim realized that what was really important to him were a few things, and he wanted to make sure that these things would happen after he passed. And one of the things is to have a space dedicated to showing the work, his work along with his colleagues. And he collected pieces of his friends over time, as all artists do. You trade pieces. But our goal in the creation of a museum is to acquire pieces by donation, because we have no money, but to acquire pieces by artists that really made an impact here, and to be able to continue to preserve and protect that work and exhibit it. And the ultimate goal will be to start to put them together into shows with maybe their students, into shows with other artists around the country, and to curate works, not just solo shows by our favorite artists. One of the other things Jim wanted to do was to establish residencies where senior artists could collaborate and share information with each other with young artists. And that was one of the goals for the Art Center, being having space above for students or for artists of all stages in their career to be together. But through the establishment of residencies, we can be very directed about that. And so that's one of the other goals that we are working on, as well as educating the public and artists and collectors about how to preserve this work and the value of preserving it. So I'm here to help Stephanie and Aaron Leedy, who run the Art Center, make this a reality. We have a board that's been meeting regularly. We're doing all of the things that need to be done in order to be recognized as a private operating foundation, as we are. But I think I was mostly asked to come into this role because it's easier for me to ask for money than Stephanie. So a big part of my job has been to ask for money, though I'm not doing that today. I want to thank you all for being here. These workshops that we're going to do will be inexpensive or free, but that's what we're doing here. At the same time, the Leedy Volkes Art Center is continuing in its whole history, and will continue to show works of artists at all levels of their careers. There continue to be student shows. We are the largest private gallery in Kansas City. And we are just about to open the smallest gallery in Kansas City. So when that happens, I can't wait for you to come to see that. Only a few at a time can get in there, but it's coming. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah. Here, in the space, in a secret location. No, on this floor.
Are you guys at all working with the Joni Mitchell Foundation in Louisiana? They have a huge legacy.
Well, the Joni Mitchell Foundation has more than one location. The primary one is in New York. They've been exceedingly difficult to get on the phone or get a meeting with. When I was in New York City, I almost just burst into the office, but then someone did answer the phone, and then it got nowhere past that. So we will continue to pursue them. It would be great to do some kind of crossover, get some of their people or some of their artists who've gone through their legacy. They've actually worked with artists, provided the funding, and an archivist to go through and inventory work with artists. But that's in the future. We haven't gotten that far yet.
Also, there's going to be, correct me if I'm wrong, but with every legacy artist, some permanent pieces that are donated, and we're donating pieces, 10 or so. Hasn't exactly been picked out yet, but after this show comes down, that's the plan, is to donate some pieces that'll be part of the permanent collection and for show, and you guys will be able to curate that and keep it going.
Hallelujah. We're so grateful for that, because it's really important. It's just really important to make accommodations for your work, whether it's to give select pieces to family members, which I'm sure you'll be doing as well, but to get it into collections. And one of the things about working with artists as part of the foundation is finding out what's your history, where did you go to school, where did you go to grad school, what other collections are you in, and to begin to figure out ways to get more of your work in those collections. And so these are our giant intentions, our big goals, and this is what we're trying to accomplish. I thank every one of you for coming today. I couldn't be more thrilled with the audience and the participation and the numbers, and I welcome you to watch on our website. We have a workshop that was planned with Elizabeth Kirsch, but that's a little bit soft right now, but there will be something coming pretty soon for artists directly to talk about legacy.
And then I'm with Joe will have a talk this afternoon.
Yeah,
Hawk Contemporary.
Hawk Contemporary at 2 o'clock. Yep. I have a show up and I'll be espousing about that.
Congratulations.
So everybody's welcome to come to that if you
Thank
would
you
like.
all so much for participating and for being here.
Thank
It really
you.
means a lot to us, and I think to Catherine and Jake that you were here.
Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you, guys.
Means a lot to us, too.